Hey guys, welcome to Now That's Debatable. This is your host, Fantastic Facade. I am joined with a special guest, Kafei, and of course I am joined with my co-host, Triple A the Humanist. I'm going to go ahead and get our faces up on the screen here momentarily. But before we do that, I'm going to do something a little different that I don't normally do. If you've watched our videos and you've enjoyed any part of them, subscribe now. We just hit 100 subscribers, and we're small, but we've been at it a while, and I think we deserve it. So if you haven't liked us or subscribed to us yet, do so, because I know our videos get long and you don't always watch all of them. So do it before you watch the video. And if you end up hating it, you can unsubscribe. So we're going to go ahead and take off, and I'm going to get our faces up on the screen. And I'm just going to do a sound check, and while we're doing that, Kafei, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, we're going to make sure we can be heard everywhere, and you can kind of let us know what we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. I noticed that you put the title as Psychedelics with Kafei, man. A lot of people associate me with that, but I'm not really about that. I'm more about like altered states of consciousness. Okay. Whether it be, lucid dreams, states inside a seizure, near-death experience, meditative states, all sorts of just different states of consciousness. And especially mystical experience, which are associated with psychedelics and psychedelics. I have experience with psychedelics as well, but I never make that the emphasis. Although I'm sure it'll come up, and I've been on kind of jumping around the scene for a little while. I've been caught into the atheist experience probably since like 2006, somewhere around there. And I'm pretty familiar with all the forums. Some of the people in the community are familiar with me and my bailiwick, but yeah, that's pretty much it. I've been interested in these topics. I do follow the neuroscience. I do study comparative religion, and I do consider myself a perennialist in that type of theism. And of course, I'll explain what that is if you're unfamiliar in a bit, but I'll leave it at that for right now.
Okay. So I have a question. So is it your view that there is some sort of transcendent realm and beings there that is like remote from where we live and interact, and that these mythical experience can act as a communication channel between the two realms?
I don't want to get in the confusion of let's make a parody of it real quick and say the Mortal Kombat realm or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah. And
it can be something as simple as like God communicating through a mythical experience.
Yeah, I do believe that there are transcendent states of consciousness, and some people do call them like a spiritual realm or something like that. Mm-hmm. And there are plenty of archetypes there. Using Carl Jung's term, he would speak about demons, sprites, angels, and so forth. And people do have encounters with that inside these phenomena. But I don't want to clump it all together, because I think people can get real confused when you do that. They do occur on a spectrum, and on the lighter side of the spectrum, even in if you look into the professional studies, like in the studies at Johns Hopkins on psilocybin-induced mystical experience, they have a criteria where a volunteer must hit 6 attributes on this criteria to have what they call a complete mystical experience. Mm-hmm. And so some volunteers will hit partial, and they do make this very powerful distinction between what they call archetypal visionary states and then what they call unitive or complete mystical experience.
No, what's a mystical experience?
Yeah, so it can reside on this spectrum, and so on the archetypal visionary aspect of it, people will have experiences that are unique to them. Like, let's say if you grow up Christian, you might see Christ on the cross. If you grow up in India with Hinduism, you might see Shiva, Ganesh. If you grow up in with Islam, then you might see Muhammad.
Could you give me like a definition of a mystical experience?
Yeah. Okay. So the 6 criteria. I can give you the 6 bullet points that they offer.
Sure. Yeah. Whatever you got to give a good description of it.
Yeah. So the main one is unicity, or what they call is the mystics, the oneness. So they also refer to this as non-dual, meaning that right now you perceive me on the screen, I look at you, but there's a division in our perception where you have the subject and the object dichotomy. You have this division. Well, in a non-dual complete mystical experience, that collapses, and so there's no longer a division between that boundary. And so
like, for instance, like if I were to have a mystical experience of Jesus, I would, in the experience, I'd become Jesus.
Well, you see, that's what I was trying to get at. That so in the visionary states, you might have a perception of Christ, like something that's separate from yourself. And then in the mystical, the unitive state, there is no there are no boundaries at that point. There is no separateness. There is no between, whether it be life and death, or time, past and future. Past and future collapse into the moment. So there's no distinction. There are no distinctions between anything in that state of mind. And I think those are the heights.
Do you think?
Can I use a psychological term here? Maybe that would help. When you say unity or oneness, would you say that's a complex?
Well, there are complexes in psychology. Like there is terms in psychology that they used to refer to this. Like Freud called it the oceanic feeling. But I mean, in neuroscience and even in psychology today, they are adopting these terms from neuroscience. It's originally laid down by William James. This term mystical experience. And it's definitely not,
really
something to do
question.
with
So
something
I'll try it again. When you say unity in a mystical experience, are you referring to what psychologists refer to as a complex? Do you know what a complex is? I mean, you said psychology.
No, I'm familiar with the complex.
For instance,
but
I
hero never
complex, or the Oedipus complex, or the invincible complex. When one has this unity experience, would you say that they are experiencing a complex?
Well, complex are usually associated with, kind of out of the norm states of mind, like Oedipus.
No, that's not an out of state mind. That is literally just referred to.
Well, no, I didn't say out of state. I said like out of the norm.
Okay, but that even then, how would you define that as normal or abnormal? He basically just wanted to have sex with his mom. But he didn't know it was his mom at the time, so the reason it came up is because it became kind of a trope, if you will, for things like, incest. But before
the thing is
modernity and we learned about genetics, incest was kind of a thing.
Yeah, the reason I would probably not associate like that is because I've never heard a psychologist refer to a mystical experience as a complex, but maybe there are some that are.
The psychologist you referred to earlier does.
Which one?
Carl Jung.
Oh yeah, Jung.
He literally says
Jung
spirits and demons are complexes.
Jung referred to it as the collective unconscious.
He says, "quote spirits are complexes of the collective unconscious." That is a direct quote. That's why I was asking if you refer to your mystical experience as a
I mean, you're kind of using it in the same sense that he used archetype.
Again, this is where a complex comes in. This is what I'm talking about, like hero complex or Oedipus complex or invincible complex. It's basically this concept in your head that you are something. Which is why I was asking if this unity complex isn't, or this unity that you're speaking of as the first bullet point, is a complex. Because it would be taking on the identity of something in the sense that you genuinely feel that you are invincible, or you genuinely feel that you are a superhero, or you genuinely feel that you want to have sex with your mother. That's what a complex is.
I guess to get past part of this this portion of the discussion, then sure, you can probably refer to it as a complex. You know,
Okay,
but I'm trying to see which, you know, I've never heard the like Jung refer to like the complete mystical experience as a complex in and of itself. He would refer to it as the collective unconscious.
well, that's
so
us speaking specifically on bullet point number 1 when he says, like, when you said unity
Yeah,
as a complex,
I
not as a
would.
whole.
Well, I mean, the mystical experience. You see, that's one aspect of it. In order to meet criteria, you must meet all 6 aspects simultaneously.
Right, but
Not
all
just
I was doing was trying to get you to clarify part number 1 and asking you, is that a complex?
The unity. I'm well. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying sure. I just never heard anyone in particular refer to that.
sure, it could be that, but you've never heard
Yeah,
you
I've
never heard
it
that
that way.
label used for that term. So
Yeah, I've never
do you
heard.
do you think the mystical experience, is this something that, like, is it some sort of communication channel with something outside of their head, or is it completely mental?
Yeah, see, that's real difficult for you know, people to describe because, like I said, you know, when I refer to this non-duality,
Mhm.
the impression that you get, you may because of this uh, you know, unitive state, you have the impression that either you could say everything is subjective or everything's objective because it makes no difference from that vantage point. And
Okay,
so,
well, like, so how about this? Let's say I'm having a mystical experience, right? And I'm experiencing things, I'm seeing, I don't know, Jesus or whatever, right?
mhm.
The things the things that are in my experience, do they have their own ontology outside of me?
Yeah, I see what you're getting at with that. I don't think
Mhm.
it's that one's really hard to say, man, because like are you familiar with Aldous Huxley's Mind at Large or the
Yeah.
Reducing Valve of Consciousness?
Mm.
Uh, okay, so he had this notion that your brain right now is filtering reality. That you know that what you experience right now is just a very small trickle of the full bandwidth of reality. And
Yeah.
so when you have a mystical experience, what's happening is these filters are being removed, and so you're actually experiencing the, you know, the
Okay,
highest.
so that all right. So I think you just answered my question. So all right, so you're saying, so during this mystical experience, like you're experiencing a part of reality that when you're conscious, you're blinded to or blocked
Yeah,
from. Okay,
yes,
so all right, cool. So what evidence do we have of that?
of
Yes,
like
like
yeah, no,
you
no,
said so in this.
I definitely hear you, man.
Okay.
You know, mystical experience. I mean, even neuroscience is barely scuffing its feet at the door of trying to understand not just the mystical experience, but consciousness itself.
Sure.
And you know, I don't think a question like that is really answered or could be evidence in a neuroscientific regard. You know,
So it sounds like you're saying there isn't any evidence of it.
no, I don't. I wouldn't say there isn't.
Okay.
I think when people do have these experiences, you know, like, you know, they come back down to the baseline of consciousness, thinking that this reality is the dream, that what they experienced there was more real than what you are experiencing now.
They could think that, but
Sure,
what I'm
but
looking
there's
for is the truth. What is in
no.
actuality? What is
No,
happening?
I definitely hear you, man. And what I'm trying to say is that, you like if you had this phenomenon occur to yourself, you may come down thinking the exact same thing. You know, like you may not be able to distinguish what was more real. And
I had a I had an experience when I was in high school that I wasn't on any drugs or anything. I was just sleeping, and I could this is about as close to a mystical experience that that I could think of. Like
yeah,
in my experience, I saw what I thought was Jesus. So
mhm.
okay, so would you say that in my experience that there I was communicating with something that it actually existed outside of my mind.
Well, no, I think like in even in Christianity, this is referred to as a Christophany, when you have a vision of Christ. And, you know, I think it's a very particular type of mystical experience. But I think it's on the lower bandwidth of mystical experiences, that this distinction I was trying to make. Where,
okay, but
you know,
like, let me pause you there, and I'm not trying to be rude. I swear I'm not. But so Triple A asked you about an experience he described to you, and he asked you, would that be, you know, on, you know, the spectrum of mystical experiences? And then you just define what a Christophany was, which most Christian people know what that is already.
well,
Can
no,
you
what I'm saying
address
is
what he asked? Because it seems like you just said, like, there's no evidence for it, or there is evidence, but what you just described was a Christophany. Like, we're hitting two different places here. He asked about this experience, and then you define what the experience was. He already gave you what the experience was. We're asking you, in your opinion, do you think that he was having communications with something external, or was this all internalized in his brain?
No, I don't think like the Christ that he witnessed that was supposedly out there was real, something you could knock on. You know, I don't think it was real in that sense, but it was real as an archetype within the subconscious of his mind. And, you know, a lot of people who have this experience will have that. Like, they will see something that's very, you know, that touches their innermost core, that's something that helps them, that, you know, aids them through, they could quit a life drug addiction, or they can.
But that's not the same. I think we might be like misusing terms here, because like, so when you say real in my mind, that's not something that I would consider real.
Well, it's
a little bit equivocating on the word real here. You know what I mean?
Well, no, that's what I was careful not to do. Like I said, it's not real in the sense that you could knock on it. Isn't that the sense that you mean by real?
Well, yeah. I mean, there are things that exist that I couldn't knock on. Like, I couldn't knock on grab it. I mean, I'm asking, does it exist anywhere?
What I mean in your what I mean is in your particular case of witnessing Christ, you wouldn't consider it real in that you could go up and hug him. You know what I mean? Like,
okay, but
yeah,
like,
so
you
like,
can't hug gravity or particles or anything like that. But we know they exist, right? We're asking external of AAA's mind, does this exist in our own reality?
Yeah, in any realm.
Like,
it could be like
absent of his mind. Like, if hypothetically we took a shotgun and blew his brains out, now he doesn't exist anymore. That vision of Christ that he supposedly had, or that he thought he had back when he was in high school, would that still exist in some realm, universe, whatever, because it is a genuine thing, or did it only exist because his mind produced it? Because I can, like, back in the day when I was a child, we used this term called imagination, and I could imagine this being or deity or monster, but that gives it no reality. It only exists in my head. I can describe it to you vividly. I can give you descriptions of what it might look like or feel like or smell like, and I can tell my brain that it's so real that I can have nightmares about it, and it will become more real to me. But the reality, the world we live in, is only impacted to it by the fact that it's in my head. If I never tell you about it, there's no possible way for you to know anything about this being. There's no way for you to examine it, study it. There's no way for you to know anything about it, because the only place it exists is in my mind. Is that true for his experience as well? Or do you think that's true for his experience as well? Or do you think there is some realm or universe or dimension in which mystical experiences actually exist?
All right, I would say, I agree with Jung that it's a common archetype that people see, that, you know, like, that's why it's called a Christophany, because it's a common occurrence, you know.
But so I don't think you understand. So, like,
but it's not real in the sense. Okay. That other sense. He was
okay, sure. So, like, it could be an archetype that a lot of people have. Like, I can have a vision of Jesus. Basad can have a vision of Jesus. You can have a vision of Jesus. But okay, so from my view, those visions would just be in our mind. what we're asking is the things that we're experiencing in the vision. Does it have its own ontology?
That one, okay. I would say not, like, again, not in the sense of, like, the real, in the sense of knocking. I have heard more, like, I don't have as much experience with psychedelics as people might think. I don't know if you ever heard Terrence McKenna. If you've never heard of Terrence McKenna, this guy smoked, he vaped DMT about 70 times in his lifetime, and he's real, well versed with psychedelic experience. And he did, mention these outlandish visions of, alien artifacts, Mayan architecture, so on and so forth, that it was so convincing to him that he thought maybe he was kind of piercing into some kind of veil of a parallel dimension that's maybe
sure. But I'm not asking what can be persuasive, right, or convincing. I'm asking, like, what's real.
Yeah,
I mean, so whether or not you can have these visions, or whether or not they're advanced, or have, aliens or Jesus or whatever they are, whatever this mystical experience is, the core question that both of us are trying to ask, and we're not asking how you define them, or what can be done, or how limited or unlimited they are, or what people experience. We're asking, is there some ontology on their own? By that we mean, do they exist outside of a person's mind? Like, do they exist outside of a person's mind?
I totally get that. You're gonna laugh if I tell you this one, man. When I had my first complete mystical experience, you kind of go through the levels, right? So when I was talking about these archetypal visionary, I had a vision of Bill Hicks, and he's the dead comedian. And of course, I don't think he's, he was alive in front of me. I know he's dead, but nevertheless, this is what, I wasn't very religious at the time. And I don't think you necessarily have to have a religious figure, accompanying these experiences. And so I don't think he had some kind of ontology in the sense of, that he came back to life for a moment.
No.
Okay, so to me...
So let's say this. Let's say the universe, right? I like Thanos snap it out of existence, right? There is no longer any sort of conscious minds here in the universe. No minds that's able to experience. All right. Now, the things that people did experience, do those things still exist?
Okay, I see where you're getting at. And I think it's kind of confusing to keep it at this level of the archetype level. Like to go on to, like, to speak on the complete mystical experience, because I that's really the crux and the height of this phenomenon. This is where it no longer.
Could you just give me like a yes or no to that question now?
Man, I mean, let me see.
And by the way, just so you're aware, and this is the same for us on the show, if new information is presented and you end up changing your mind in the future, no one's going to nail you to the cross on this one. I'm just asking an opinion here.
We're not trying to trap you.
Yeah, no. Let me put it this way then. I don't know whether that has some type of afterlife ontology. Like, it could be that Bill Hicks,
So do you think an afterlife exists?
I don't. I couldn't say for sure. Otherwise,
because to me it seems like a mystical experience. If it depends on an afterlife, would then need an afterlife to exist.
Yeah, and
you see how it gets more complicated.
I don't have enough experience. I'm no mystic, and I don't have enough experience with psychedelics to say that. But I will say that I have studied, very intensely comparative religion. And, or even in the neuroscientific studies with the mystical experience, like, a lot of volunteers will say at the height of this experience that consciousness seems like something that's indestructible, that cannot die.
Okay.
I mean, we know that is definitely wrong, though, at least medically speaking. Because that's the definition of brain dead.
You've been dead before?
No, that's the definition of brain dead.
Well, but how do you know that consciousness, blinks out at that point?
Because the brain is what produces your consciousness.
I disagree. I don't think there's any evidence for that.
Really?
Have you not read like Phineas Gage or like literally any of the other, like any modern neuroscience that talks about like brain surgery and or manipulation when the brain is damaged? We literally know conscious is directly impacted by the physical brain.
Yes, there seems to be a direct correlation between the two.
No, I understand.
Like the brain,
the thing is, okay, I understand that's a popular atheistic model. I don't think there's any evidence in neuroscience for that. I know that the brain correlates, like it can correlate to damage, it can change your personality and so forth. But
okay, you know, your consciousness is your personality, right?
Yeah.
And if your conscious can directly be impacted by physical changes in the brain and by chemical changes in the brain.
Sure. I know, so I completely get that.
And by the way, other than those two things, we haven't noticed any way to manipulate people's consciousness other than physical or chemical changes in the brain. So there's two things we can point to that definitively point to changes in the brain. Chemical changes that happen and physical changes that happen. And both and only those two things manipulate your consciousness. We have no evidence to support anything else.
If you actually look into neuroscience, you'll find that there's no absolute evidence that.
We're not saying absolute evidence, right? So, I mean, like science, right? The evidence you find is always subject to revision. But from what I can tell right now, do you think it's a coincidence that your experience always happens to be where your brain is located? Like you're experiencing your room, and your brain is in your room.
I'll give you.
Could you put your brain in your car and still experience your room?
No, I don't think so.
Right. So, like, I mean, so it seems to be correlated, right? Like your experience, your consciousness always follows.
I definitely agree with that. I definitely agree that it's correlated. But
correlated. So then, where else would it be? It's a very strong correlation.
I mean, we have two direct correlations and nothing else.
Exactly, but it doesn't always mean correlation doesn't mean causation. However, when the correlation is so strong, you could be justified in inferring causality from that, right? So, like, I snap my fingers, you hear a sound, right? I speak, you hear a sound. Right. Yeah. So there's a correlation between the sound and me moving my mouth and snapping my fingers. Right. But like the correlation is so strong, you could be justified in inferring causality from it. Now, this is what we do in science all the time.
But you see, this is you could be justified in inferring, but it's not necessarily the case, is what I'm trying to argue.
As far as evidence presented, right? Let me handle this one real quick. As far as evidence presented, as I mentioned, there's only two things that are known to manipulate the brain. That's physical changes and chemical changes, right? We have seen these two over and over and over again. In fact, we know that manipulating or destroying the brain physically causes consciousness to cease.
Yeah.
Okay, we know that people that have chemical changes, such as drugs, such as depression, such as anything like that, like even things like obesity, can manipulate how the brain functions because it manipulates how the brain receives chemicals and sends chemicals, right? So we know, hand in hand, both physical changes such as brain surgery, brain damage, things getting poked in the brain, people getting shot in the brain, etc., and chemical changes, things like drinking, drugs, prescribed medication, additional medications to get into the bloodstream, both can alter the brain. And as far as we can tell, and as far as science has shown, there is nothing else that can manipulate the brain. Okay? Now, I'm not saying there's not technology out there that doesn't exist that will one day be able to influence the brain, or there might be some signal that can be produced that can impact how the brain functions. However, I don't have good evidence of that right now. The good evidence stands on chemical and physical changes to the brain manipulate how the brain works. It would be a fool's errand to try to disprove that physical or chemical reactions are not caused by that do not impact the brain and or are not the primary causation for all interactions in the brain.
No, you've reiterated that point. Okay, let me put it in a different way that might shed some light on these two views. All right. I love one of the metaphors that Graham Hancock used once. He said, there is an atheistic assumption that the consciousness is produced by the brain, and just for the reasons you just stated. And the analogy he uses is like a factory that produces cars, right? So if you destroy the factory, then the cars stop being produced. The car represents consciousness. So if you destroy the factory, consciousness blinks out. It's no longer there. That's the common assumption. So on a spiritualist side, let's go to the other side now. It's more analogous to a radio receiver. So let's say the brain is the physical radio, while consciousness is the signal that's being received. If you destroy the radio, you're gonna alter the way the signal is being received. It's gonna have the same exact effect as both models are gonna look exactly the same.
Kafei, this backs with analogy with our brain acting as a radio that's receiving a signal, right? Yeah. There is no evidence of the signal outside of the radio.
The evidence
it's more like it's more like a production of the signal than a receiver, because a receiver would mean that there's constant input from an external force.
There's no evidence of that. So here's a way you can experiment. Maybe if you could isolate the brain, put it inside of a box, and then it stop, then the experience stop. Right, that would be good evidence that this consciousness is acting that the brain is acting as a receiver and it's receiving consciousness from some other realm or something like that. But from what we can tell, there is no evidence of that whatsoever.
Well, okay, let's say you're saying it's solely produced by the brain. Then, in a sense, you're arguing that you are producing you're almost making a solipsistic argument that
No. So what we're talking about is experience, not the things that we're talking about experience itself, consciousness, not the things that I experience. Like I'm experiencing this conversation with you, right? Yeah. I don't think you exist in my brain, so I'm having an experience of having a conversation with you. Right, so but we're talking about experience itself. So this isn't solipsism. We're just talking about just consciousness.
Sure.
Right. And I get how you can blur the line on solipsism, because obviously there's things like people hear voices, people have hallucinations, people have these visions, right? And so I understand where you're coming from with solipsism. However, there are additional steps you can take to manage reality, such as a shared experience. Like, for instance, you, AAA, and I could all meet up somewhere in person. And now you have a shared experience between AAA and I, saying we both are experiencing the same thing, independent of each other, but simultaneously. Yeah. Right? And then we could shake your hand and okay, this feels real. Now, admittedly, the brain can be deceived into thinking it's shaking someone's hand. I'm not saying it can't. I'm just saying we have other methods to determine what exists outside of our brain. And people who don't, by the way, they're called schizoid personality disorder. They're having trouble determining what's in their brain versus what's in reality that's shared amongst us people, right? It's called schizoid personality, and it's a hard determination for things like books and TV, and they take on these persona or complexes of television or protagonist in books in their head, and that unfortunately becomes their own internal reality. However, we know that things like being able to jump over a building like Superman doesn't exist in our reality, right? So we know that if someone says, I can do that, they're making a false claim in reality. They may believe it in their head, but there's no way the physical body is capable of doing something like that, right? So we know there's an easy way to determine, especially on things like superhero complexes and etc., when people have schizoid personality disorder, there's a really easy, tangible way of just kind of shutting that down, and there's good medication and therapy that helps along with that as well. But there's no good indication that there's an external signal, if you will, being received by the brain. It seems the opposite is true, that the brain is the radio pushing out signal. And that signal gets reverberated by your experience. Your eyes put in input, your touch puts in input, you can get hurt, you have pain receptors, they're input. You get hungry, that's chemical changes. Your brain gets hit by a rock. You have physical changes and personality changes. goes hand in hand one way, not the other. We don't have any experience for the other side, but we have all the experience saying this is true.
I think what you said could be summed up in what's called consensus reality and indirect realism. Perhaps you're familiar with those two. Indirect realism, meaning that, what we perceive is not necessarily something that's real in the sense that, it's something that conjures or manifests in reality. It's something that it's a signal like produced by our brain. I think that goes to indirect realism, and then consensus reality is us agreeing on the experience that we share.
To an extent, I will say, obviously, we have a limited reality because of our senses. So, I mean, like, the really obvious one is sight, right? So we have a limited number of colors we can see. We have a limited spectrum we can see in. We have a limited number of ways in which we can see. However, we have technology that allows us to see in additional things like infrared or heat sensor or etc. Right? Like, X-ray.
The brain creates a model that we proceed to live in. So what our brain is producing is a model of reality based on our experience.
So, all right. So, Kafei, can you tell me what evidence do you have to support the idea that our brain is just acting as a receiver to some other?
Well, okay.
force?
That's. Do you guys study superstring theory at all, or M theory?
I do.
Okay, so you've probably heard someone like Michio Kaku say that in the very room that you're sitting in right now, simultaneously exists every other possible universe. The universe where Hitler won the war, where dinosaurs never died.
He said that. Michio Kaku, he's kind of a quack, but okay, but
it's based on
actual. No, it's not. It's not. So like superstring theory makes awesome mathematical sense, but there's no empirical evidence that is correct.
Well, yeah, and definitely. I mean, they can't test anything in superstring theory. It would require the energy of Planck energy to even
So what I was asking for was like evidence. Like, so superstring theory can be evidence. As a matter of fact, I can't even see. I mean, I can't even justify Michio Kaku's assertion based off superstring theory. But if you're admitting that there's no evidence of it,
well, I wouldn't.
We can't use that, right?
Yeah, there's no scientific evidence. I would say something like that.
Okay, what type of evidence
in
do you
general
have?
Exist?
All right, so
non-scientific evidence.
The archetypes aside, when you start to like, okay, for instance, with psychedelics, because I think that's probably the only way you guys would probably approach this if you ever dabbled with it yourselves. Like, you probably wouldn't have the patience to sit down and meditate for a few hours. Maybe you might try Terence McKenna's heroic dose.
I mean,
right?
I've meditated for hours before. But I mean, I didn't have an experience from it.
I'm also talking about years upon years, not just.
Okay, sure, but let's say I did that, I haven't experienced. Okay, how do I know specifically that my consciousness is not originating in my brain, and instead I'm receiving it from somewhere else?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm trying to get at. At the very heights of these states, there is no distinction. Like there is no way to.
No, okay, but no. So
I mean,
my consciousness either originates in my brain or it does not originate in my brain, right?
I couldn't answer that.
No. This is a true dichotomy.
That's a true dichotomy.
Yeah, it either originates in my brain or it does not originate in my brain.
I don't know if you ever heard the quote, like we're all separate beings phasing into one consciousness. I forgot who said that.
That's not relevant.
Sure,
he made a direct dichotomy. Like it's a direct dichotomy. So something either is or it is not, right?
Yeah. Well, no. I guess what I'm trying to argue is I don't believe it to be a true dichotomy.
What's the third option?
What is the third option?
The third option would be one consciousness. There's only one consciousness.
Okay, but it either originates in someone's brain or it does not. That is the only way it could exist.
I know. I think we all have various aspects, and we all tune into it from various vantage points.
Okay, so you would say that it does not originate from a brain because there are various aspects that tunes in or people can tap into, and it's not only from the brain.
That's the spiritualist view. Yes.
That's a true dichotomy over with.
All right. So there's two possibilities. Okay, so now evidence that it originated in the brain would be once if you alter the brain, you alter consciousness. You destroy the brain, you destroy consciousness. And from what we can tell, that seems to be the case. And by your own admission, you said there was no scientific evidence to suggest otherwise. Right? So now I'm asking, what type of evidence do you have to show that consciousness is originating somewhere else?
Or that people can tap into other things outside of their brain.
Yeah.
Man, I mean, the best, the one that convinced me is, this complete mystical experience. I mean, that's all I.
Okay, but so you said you had a mystical experience,
right? Let me pause you real quick, right? What is so convincing about the complete mystical experience that you feel it is not internal? Because, by the way, and I didn't watch all the lectures that you had. I didn't have time. I didn't watch all the lectures you said. I have seen lots of experience. I've watched lots of videos on LSD. I've watched lots of on ayahuasca. I've watched lots of out-of-body experiences, which I don't really prefer the term, near-death experiences, etc. And in the very few cases in which we have somebody's brain hooked up to like a MRI or a CAT scan when they're dying or when they're on drugs, we see direct correlation between how the brain lights up and what these people are claiming as an experience. So my question is, how are you determining that? And I'm not trying to debunk or debate. You claim you had this experience. By all means, you had the experience. I'm not trying to take that away from you. I'm just trying to understand how you determined that it's not all internal, because your brain is capable, as we discussed earlier, of some pretty incredible things. Back when you were a kid, you called it your imagination. And people that have vivid dreams, like sleep paralysis causing dreams, claim they see demons that sit on them. But we know in reality, because we've measured people and watched people that have sleep studies, there's no scientific evidence of anything external happening to these people. This is all occurring only within their head, which, by the way, can be a very powerful, persuasive, and consuming thing. It's okay to claim that mystical experiences are only internal, and you had this life-changing thing happen because your brain is you. But the question that both he and I have, and the reason that we point to science and evidence and the reality that we share, is because if it's not internal, you have to be able to point to something external that can cause this mystical experience. And it sounds like, even in your case, or even in cases of Christophanies, or people claiming to see Krishna, or people claiming that they can fly, or see demons, or that are causing sleep paralysis, in every case that we've ever had measurements on, that there is a direct correlation with activity matching in the brain, with chemicals that produce dopamine and serotonin and that cause hallucinations. We know from other medications such as morphine that causes pain loss. We know from SSRIs and in pain inhibitors that get released in the brain when people are dying, that when people say there's this peacefulness about them, it's because their brain is overflowing with a chemical reaction. And it's okay. It's a very internal mental thing. And we have no evidence to suggest that there's anything physical. If you think your complete mystical experience, your 6 bullet point thing that you experienced, I have no doubt you experienced it. And like I said, I'm not trying to take it away from you. But if you think it was anything other than a mental state, can you point us to something, maybe not scientifically, but to something in reality that we could look at, observe, or examine to show for it? Because if I was going to look at it, I'd probably go for a CAT scan first. And I bet you my next paycheck that we'd see direct correlation with the brain patterns on people that are on drugs or on LSD or acid or psilocybin acid or magic mushrooms or anything like that, that when they're doing that, we see direct correlation with the same people that are claiming to have these mystic experiences, because there is a direct correlation between how the brain does things like acid and how people are claiming things like religious Christophanies. We have seen it over and over. There has been multiple studies pointing it out. So if that is not the case, if that is not what you believe, the only thing that we really want to know, and the only thing that we're asking, is what could we point to show that it's not an internalized mechanism? What external exists?
Before I answer that question real quick, I just wanted to point out that, I gave that example of the factories and the cars being produced, and then I gave the example of the radio model. And, you've made this point several times that, the correlation of the damage and so forth, even if you damage the radio, it's going to alter the way that signals received in the very precise way that the factory being destroyed is going to alter how.
I'm actually going to challenge you on that, because I don't think you quite understand how a receiver works or how signal works. A signal isn't manipulated by the thing that's receiving it. So it's not like a radio in that sense. In fact, you and I are kind of using a two-way radio right now. When I talk to you, if you are deaf, that doesn't change what I'm saying.
Yeah, but I mean,
because you have like a hearing impairment doesn't change the signal that's being sent across this microphone.
It won't,
and just like a radio doesn't change the signal based off of what it's receiving. Yeah, however, if it's producing a signal and it's damaged,
I think he's saying, so like if the receiver is damaged, then the output could be altered. Like it couldn't.
Okay, but the output is the consciousness. What we're talking about, we're not the input. You just said like a radio receiver, and the output is the cars, right? The cars is the consciousness. Well, if it's receiving something, that's not an output. That's a receiver. That's an input.
Well, yeah.
No.
That's the brain is kind of like the transceiver, and if that's damaged, it's gonna appear just as it would with Phineas Gage and any other example you want to give. It's going to look exactly the same as in the atheistic model. They're going to look identical. So,
I want to correct that in the sense that an atheistic model is a model about God. It has nothing to do with the brain state. But
well, I mean, it's a common assumption I hear from atheists that, consciousness is generated by the brain. It's a common assumption that I hear, and if you
it has nothing to do with atheism.
You could be an atheist and believe in souls and spirits and
sure, but I'm just saying I hear it commonly amongst atheists. It doesn't have to necessarily be associated with atheism solely, but what I'm trying to say, I challenge you after the podcast, man, to find any peer-reviewed neuroscientific paper that establishes consciousness is generated by the brain. You will not find it, man.
But all we can tell is that it's the brain. Like we don't have any examples of consciousness besides the brains.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you had said earlier that correlation doesn't equal causation. Right.
Yeah.
Like science can only establish correlations.
Yeah.
Right? We can't establish causality. Right. But we can establish really strong correlations. Whereas if it's not being caused by that, there is something really weird. This is like one hell of a coincidence.
Yeah.
Right.
I know. I definitely hear you guys, man. I study this obsessively myself, man. I looked into pretty much every paper.
I guess the question I'm having then is like, are you proposing some external mechanism, or are you just saying there's no concrete evidence showing that the brain is, or the consciousness is generated by the brain?
To advance it a little further, the discussion. What I'm trying to say is that at the height of this complete mystical experience, there is the impression inside a phenomenon in consciousness where you could say that all experience that there is experienced simultaneously. Like you have the sense that you were the tree, the grasshopper, you were every infinite being that ever was and ever will be. All time collapses, past and future. That you were the totality of existence itself. That your identity no longer resides in the material body. That you now identify with all that there is. And of course, you wouldn't say, well, there's no such thing that of all that there is, because that's exactly what we experience. Well, we experience it very finite, very trickled. Like that's what I was trying to say about the mind at large. You know, that Aldous Huxley was saying that our mind is being filtered right now. You know, and we just only perceive out of the perception of our ego. And that's what, you know, how we comport ourselves and speak to each other and are able to have this conversation in. But at the heights of those at that complete mystical experience, there is no distinction there.
Did you ever read
so let me try this. So
out of curiosity?
What do you say for that?
Really random. Did you ever read Brave New World?
I know, but I read the Perennial Philosophy and the Doors of Perception.
Okay, I was just curious.
I read excerpts of Brave New World. I've never read the whole book though.
So, it sounded like, so when I was trying to get to like earlier at the beginning of the stream, right? I was trying to figure out if the things that we're experiencing and these mystical experiences, do they have their own ontology? Like, because now it seems like you'd say yes to that question.
Yeah,
they do have their own ontology. Okay. All right. So cool. Now the question is, not even talking about consciousness anymore. What evidence do we have of that?
Of consciousness?
No, not of consciousness. No, the things that I'm experiencing in the mythical experience, right? The things that I'm seeing, right? Yeah. What evidence do we have that exists outside of my brain?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily like, you know, something, you know, like an object outside of consciousness. And what I mean by that is the way I've come to see it now, and what I mean by perennialist is that, you know, I have a fixation on studying mystics throughout the ages. And so wherever this phenomenon occurred throughout history, it would be adopted by the major religions. You would have, in fact, whoever, like a founder, a prophet who had this phenomenon, and they would become founder of a major religion. So Gautama of Siddhartha with Nirvana, you know, the Sufi mystics, Christianity with the direct revelation of the Holy Spirit.
But that doesn't make it real. That just means the people were convinced.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that what neuroscientists today refer to as mystical experience is precisely one and the same of what you know, a Christian mystic may have called the direct revelation of the Holy Spirit, or a Buddhist might call Nirvana.
So it seems to me that the things that you're describing, that would indicate that it originated in the brain. Like, for instance, like, so think like this. So let's, like, in science, right? We use peer review, right? We use independent verification. So, like, let's say I look out my window and I see a white elephant, and I say, "Hey, Facade, I think there's a white elephant outside," right? And he looks out there, he sees a white elephant, right? And I say, "Hey, Kafei, look outside, you see the white elephant," and you see it too. So we all see the white elephant, right? So this would be evidence that this white elephant doesn't exist in our mind, because we're seeing the same thing. Now, with the mystical experiences, they're seeing different things. And not just different things, they're saying mutually exclusive things, because the claims in religion directly contradict claims in other religions, like in Buddhism or in Islam, right? Because Christianity is exclusive. There's only one God. He's the right way. All the other ones are false, right? So you're having these religions that are mutually exclusive coming about from these mystical experiences. To me, that indicates that is subjective, that is completely within the person's mind.
I think that might be a misconception, though. While, like, if you look into the perennial philosophy, it is undeniable that, you know, religions at the surface may appear diverse and even counterintuitive to each other, and you know, and paradoxical. But what the perennial philosophy is saying is at the core of these heights of this mystical experience, they're identical. They're one and the same. And so, like, the way
really, so when okay, so like in Christianity, like, are you familiar with Christianity at all?
Yeah.
Okay, so like it comes out, it straight up says, like Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the light. Right? No one comes to the Father but by me. Like, if without Jesus, you're going to go to hell, according to Christianity. Right? So it completely excludes the possibility of other religions. So how could
as
they
a
both
matter
be
of
true?
fact, to expand upon that, things like Hinduism and Buddhism, which preceded Christianity,
Yes.
had multiple gods, which were strictly forbidden by Christianity. So you have a distinct individual religion claiming that if you do not follow this exact subset of rules, and by the way, that subset of rules cannot include any god but the Christian God, then you're condemned to hell for all eternity. And that's what these people genuinely believe is truth. Now, I'm not saying that it's real or not. I'm just saying I don't have good evidence for it, so I don't personally believe it. However,
because if it was
the
originating
reality of the matter is the question.
If it was originating outside of the person's head, you would expect them to be seeing the same thing. Like, back to my analogy, if I looked outside and I saw a white elephant, and I tell Fasad to look outside, and he doesn't, right? Now, and I'm gonna think there may not be a white elephant outside. I'm gonna think maybe this is just something in my head. Or if he sees something else, maybe there's some other phenomenon going on that's subjective, right?
Right. So
it's like,
what
if
we
this
would do
is
is
real,
then get another
we should
person and
expect
say, "Hey,
independent
what do you
verification."
see outside?"
Could I respond to that? Okay, so I mean, you mentioned the Christ being the truth, the light. No one else comes through me. You know, I don't know how deeply you study scripture, Christian scripture, but I don't know if you've ever read John 10:30, where he says, "I and the Father are one." And if you read on through those verses, the Jews pick up a stone and stone him, and Christ replies, "You know, all these good works have I done. For which do you stone me?" The Jews reply, "We stone you not for your good works, because you, a man, call yourself God."
Yeah.
And he says, didn't I mention in your book that I have called ye gods? That's John 10:34. He calls all men and women as gods. So there could be an interpretation there that he might be missing. You know?
Okay, but even if we grant hold up. Let me handle this one. Let me get in. So what that would be called would be pantheism, which is all gods, right? Which would still go directly against what God said in the Old Testament. It would go against what Jesus said in the New Testament, and it would go against what Islam says in the Quran and the Hadith. It would go against what the Jews said in the Pentateuch. It would go against what the Hindus say in the Hindu scripture. It would go against what Taoism says, what Taoism says. Like, it literally would go against every major religion on the planet.
Oh, I disagree, because even the other
literally there are gods. There are situations in which God is the only God. He's the only thing that exists.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at. That you mentioned Hinduism, and of course, if you don't study too deeply into Hinduism, you might perceive it as a polytheism. No yogi, no Hindu yogi would call Hinduism a polytheism. They regarded in a very similar way that Jung had these archetypes. They saw the various gods and goddesses as archetypes, but there is a core principle in Hinduism, and they refer to it as Brahman. And it's not an anthropomorphic figure. It's not an insectoid figure. It's not a figure with multiple arms. This is the highest principle in Hinduism. You can look it up. It's BRAH.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the term, and then Atman is the individuality of the person, right? But that, again, distinguishes an individual from the Brahman. Yeah, Atman is the individual versus Brahman is the universal. There is still an individuality in Hinduism. Like, you're not coming to this oneness, and even then you still have other religions like undoubtedly like Islam is the undoubted go-to, which you have Allah, where if you even there is no like fundamental Islamist on the planet that would say there are any other gods. In fact, the huge like debate I see over and over again in the Islam versus Christianity debate pages on Facebook is Muslims keep throwing into Christians' faces the fact that in the Old Testament the word gods is used instead of God, or that there are other gods mentioned in, like, for instance, the Ten Commandments, etc. Whereas in Islam, they are strictly forbidden to even, like, conceive the idea that any other gods are a possibility, right? So yes, I understand that I could be misinterpreting scripture, even though that 99.99% of all Christians would say that there is a God, and there may be Trinitarians as well, but they all would recognize that as one God, and just not pantheistic, right? That's just not a general consensus amongst Christianity. And amongst Hinduism, they would say that you're right, Brahman is like a universal thing, and that the individual gods are aspects of Brahman, right? But there are undoubtedly monotheistic religions. There are undoubtedly, like, panentheistic religions. There are undoubtedly deistic religions in which, like, a single solitary God exists and he doesn't care about you. So, like, just because you can say all these religions do this, even if every religion on the planet did it, it wouldn't lend you a single credence or iota of credence towards the idea that there is a spiritual oneness that exists because religions feel this way. We're still looking for something to point to externally. And just because people believe something, that doesn't make it reality.
Well, I consider myself, as a Perennialist, I do hold to panentheism. So when you mentioned the Atman and Brahman, for example, you know, the Atman is the individual representation of the Brahman, but it's the universal.
Not according to Hinduism.
Okay, but so my issue is that you're saying, it sounds like you're saying there's some sort of fundamental core principle among all the religions that's the same. All right, so okay, I don't agree, but I can grant it, right?
Okay.
But what I'm saying is the details are vastly different. Right, so like, cause like I look out my window and I see the white elephant. If Fasad looks out the window, I'm expecting him to see a white elephant, not a polka dotted octopus, right? And we couldn't say, oh, at a fundamental level, they're the same thing, right? Because they're made of atoms, right? But no. Like the details that they're made of are fundamentally different. So like. Like you look at Christianity and you look at like Hinduism, like to me, like they're nowhere near the same.
It's funny that you say elephant. Like, have you heard of the analogy of the 5 blind men and the elephant?
Yeah.
That they're blind, but they're all touching it from different. One guy is touching.
Yeah, but they're touching it from different angles, right? It's okay. So, but
it's all one elephant.
Sure,
you know?
Sure, but okay, yeah, but the blind man. But if the blind man goes up and touch the trunk, and another blind man goes up and touch the trunk, they should be like, oh yeah, this is a thick, long thing, right?
Yeah.
Pause. Right? That sounded crazy.
In a way, that's
but okay. But what I'm saying is, so like, if 2 blind men are both touching the trunk, one shouldn't be like, oh, this is a ball, and the other one is like, oh, this is more like a log. Like they're very different things.
Well, I mean, the whole reason for this analogy is that let's say the trunk is Christianity. If 2 blind men are, they're seeing it from that aspect, whereas Buddhism's the foot, and Hinduism may be the other part of its body, and so forth.
The problem is the claims in Christianity exclude the other ones.
Like, the same can be said for Islam. The same can be said for
depending on your interpretation. You know,
no. Like, I'm telling you, like, bro, I grew up in a Christian home and a Christian family. I went to a Christian school. I went to a Christian church. I went to a Christian college. I spent a huge portion of my life amongst Bible-believing Christians. 99.9999999% of those people would say that what you're saying is wrong. That all other religions are incorrect. Christianity is the only religion, and that if you try to mix them, mash them, or say that they're one and the same, not only are you a heathen and a pagan, but you should probably be burned at the stake. Right? Like that's how Christians feel.
My argument against that is that, you know, I don't, you guys don't mind. You guys curse in the show, right?
Yeah, we don't.
George Carlin said something like, "Yeah, well, many people are fucking stupid. Shall we adopt all their standards?" When I study Christianity, I don't go to the average Christian on the street, which makes up the 99%. I go to the most, advanced theologians, the most profound Christian philosophers, the most, the most
for
renowned
instance,
Christian
like Gary Habermas is one of the most well-known theologians on the planet. I went to school where he was a professor, and he would tell you that it's a monotheistic religion with a Trinitarian view, and that if you're not a Christian, you're going to burn in hell.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Like we Fasad and I both went to the same Christian school, and we were routinely in classes with people who had PhDs in theology,
in philosophy, and theology, and like people that wrote an infinite number of books on Christian religion. Like, you may have heard of Ed Holmes, who has a famous radio show out in California. He's written about 50 books now. I've been in his classroom. I sat under Ed Holmes in a classroom. I listened to the man speak. I listened to him teach. I listened to him preach. I listened to Jerry Falwell. I listened to Jerry Falwell Sr. I listened to Gary Habermas. I've listened to some of the most renowned Christian theologians in the world. And I'm telling you, I've had conversations with these people one-on-one. To a core level, they believe that not only is Christianity a monotheistic religion, but if you hold any other belief, sincerely, they believe that you're going to burn in hell.
Well, are you familiar with Paul Tillich?
I'm
not talking about some of the contemporary theologians. I'm talking about theologians throughout history. And I study people
like Billy Graham. I went to school. Like his grandson went to school with us. We were like in his dorm room.
So I got a question.
They all felt the same thing.
For Hinduism, like you said, you're familiar with Hinduism.
Yeah, of course.
How does the world come into existence?
And it's very different from the Western view.
Just tell me, just spell it.
Okay, so they refer to it as the dance of Shiva. What they refer to as the Brahman is this all-encompassing thing, the very source of every permutation that can manifest in the material world, and it's a form of consciousness. And when it dreams the material world. It dreams that it's
and that's where the earth comes from.
It's everywhere.
Okay, all right. So in Christianity, God speaks into existence. All right.
Yeah.
Both of those things can't be true.
Well, the dream, in a way, could be seen as coming.
No. So this thing could not. So God spoke into existence. It did not exist prior to God speaking into existence. Like this wasn't something that's eternal with God. In the beginning, there was just God, according to Christianity, and then He speaks into existence. So Christianity excludes the Hindu version of creation. Is what I'm saying. They cannot both be true.
In Hinduism, the material world doesn't exist either until the Brahmin dreams it up. There can be parallels made there.
You can draw parallels, but we're not saying they contradict each other. They can't both be true.
I'm gonna just cut to the chase here. It doesn't matter if you can draw parallels. What does it matter? And why does it matter? And when you have a fundamental, obvious difference amongst major religions, then even if you drew parallels all day, it still doesn't lend any credence to the reality of there being some external oneness, if you will, as perennialism would say. The one, right? There's still no good evidence to exist. To take your quote, just because a bunch of fucking stupid people say something or believe something, if everybody on the whole planet believed that there was a giant turtle that we were on, there's no good evidence for me to believe that we're on a giant turtle. So I don't care what people believe. What I'm pointing to is evidence. And to go back to your philosophy, since you want to keep going there, let's go to one of the OGs, Plato, and the prison. Right? You have this guy, the people in prison that are there the whole time, and this guy escapes, and he recognizes there's an entire world out here that's full of lights and wonder, and when he goes back, his eyes can't even adjust to the darkness, right? My question is, how do we escape the prison and recognize the light and the real world if we're trapped here? Or is there even anything beyond the prison cell?
Well, that's what I think. The prison is the ego. Like the whole point of this complete mystical experience is the death of the ego, the temporary death of the ego. It's not like you're.
Are you referring to Freud's ego or ego in general?
What is ego death?
No, are you referring to Freud's ego or ego in general?
Yeah, ego in general, or Freud's ego, if you will. They're in the state of ego death, which is I find synonymous to a complete mystical experience. That's what dies in this phenomenon, not permanently, of course, because you're gonna return to the baseline of consciousness, but your ego will not be there in that moment at the height of that phenomenon, you know, and you know, even to mention Hinduism one more time, the way they saw it, they would say sentient beings, you know, because in their view, you know, there wasn't just one world like the way the Christians saw it, and there's many, you know, the various spheres outside. There's infinite many worlds in their view, and infinite many beings, but all of them have this potential to recognize all, the rest of all eternity, the rest of all the reality around them. And I think that's the point. Like the mystic.
Well, let me ask you a really random question. It seems a little off topic. Really random question. With people with schizophrenia, would you say they're having complete mystical experiences all the time?
I am very intrigued by schizophrenia. I'm not too sure what it is. It may be that the schizophrenics are people who have a natural inclination to mystical experience, but we don't know. I don't think it's been studied enough.
Okay, I mean, like, just to be clear, not everyone with schizophrenia has what you call multiple personalities or multiple personality disorder,
Sure.
And they're trying to distinguish the two. However, schizoid, aka schizophrenia, or schizoid, which is a subtype of schizophrenia is a known problem that exists within the brain in which people had trouble distinguishing reality from an internal mechanism. Or having a schizophrenia specific is when people are having trouble distinguishing themselves from other identities that they may have in their brain, which multiple personality disorder is. Someone can slip into a quote-unquote different personality and become a different person and interact with the human world in a state of schizophrenia. Now, schizoid personality disorder is having trouble distinguishing reality from things like books and television, etc. Typically, that's experienced amongst people who don't get out enough and have a lot of spare time in reading, video games, movies, TV shows, etc. And unfortunately have brain disorder called schizoid personality disorder, in which they have a hard time distinguishing reality from their media. Well, my question is, by your definition, would you be able to exclude people with multiple personalities from just being in a state of a complete mystical experience? And if so, why?
I think so. Because I think because the mystical experience, it's not just some recent phenomenon in neuroscience that's been studied. It's been studied for decades now, going all the way back to the work of William James in the early 1900s. And, you know, they've established and refined a lot of the literature then to the point where we have it today. And I think it's to the point where they can distinguish it from things like that nowadays. If you
okay, but by your definition, there would be no way to distinguish the two.
I disagree, man.
Okay, what would distinguish someone with schizophrenia from someone experiencing a complete mystical experience? What would be the differentiating factors?
Well, I mean,
because by the way, schizophrenia, right. We know is all internal.
Because I don't think enough is known about schizophrenia.
Well, we know it's all internal.
It's all unheard of.
Internal.
Oh, internal.
Yeah.
Perhaps, you know.
No, we know that for sure.
I really don't think it's been studied enough.
We know that that is an undoubted fact. That people that have schizophrenia, it's all internal. And by the way, it's internal, and their brain can do things like produce enough endorphins to give them the strength of one of their personalities. For instance, they may have like a protector personality that comes out in times that they feel threatened, and their brain will literally send endorphins through them to give them more strength than they would normally have. It is all internalized. We have done a dramatic number of studies on people with schizophrenia because we're studying people with multiple personality disorder. We've hooked people up to EKGs and CAT scans, and we've studied their brains, and we've seen chemical dumps in the brain when people experience another one of their personalities. We know for sure this is an internalized mechanism. We watch the brain light up in certain situations. We watch the brain light up in certain areas. We watch the brain dump chemicals into certain areas, and now they're quote-unquote a different person because they genuinely feel that they're a different person. And their brain is telling them that they're this new personality. And typically they're doing it as a defense mechanism, although there are other reasons that it happens. So my point is that if you can't distinguish something like schizophrenia from, or multiple personality disorder, I apologize if anyone has schizophrenia and they don't have multiple personalities. I keep using the terms interchangeably and I shouldn't. But if you can't determine something like multiple personalities and a complete mystical experience is to be unique of one another, and we know one is completely internalized, then it seems to me that, again, we're still lacking a foundation for some external mechanism for a mystical experience. It seems to me over and over and over again, we keep coming to the conclusion, it is your brain.
Well, I mean, I think, I would say there's certain, physiological processes that are internal for sure. But I think it comes back to this notion, and, can we establish that consciousness isn't, something that's quote unquote internal. If neuroscience can't even establish that, then there's no point in trying to.
Neuroscience is typically agreed upon the consensus that consciousness is produced by the brain. We have the two major correlations of chemical and physical changes that happen in the brain. We have direct causation of things that happen. And over again, we've established this, that neuroscience is going to point you to these two things to establish that is how the brain functions. Can you just say there is no conclusive evidence? No, you can't. Can you say there is a definitive answer and that is die hard and true, the only thing it can be? No, but at that point, how much correlation do we need? How much correlation do you need to know that we're having a conversation right now and that it's not all internalized?
Well, you see, I think that's the bet of materialism. That
it seems to me like you're dabbling on solipsism, my friend.
You want to see the glass half full,
you're dabbling with solipsism. It's a dangerous game you're playing.
Well, no, I'm not referring to the solipsism.
It seems to me like you're having a hard time distinguishing what's real and what's not. How do you know we're having a conversation?
I think what's real is seen in a different light than that. That's all.
How do you know we're having a conversation? How do you know this is not in your head?
It's there's a consensus reality, like we said before,
Okay, and, so is there a consensus among mystical experiences, given that people have literally founded unique religions based off of them that have, admittedly some things you could point to as similarities or trails, but you and I saying, I look out the window and I say, there's a white elephant, and you look out the window and you say, there's a yellow jet ski, you would say that you and I aren't seeing the same thing. So where is the consensus among mystical experiences?
Is that the height of this phenomenon is a universal phenomenon. It has nothing to do with the personal history of the individual. It has nothing to do with the space and time it occurs in. It has nothing to do with their cultural influences. Wherever this phenomenon occurs...
I can prove that to be incorrect. Fun fact, Christophanies typically occur in places predominantly Christian.
Yeah.
Christophanies, as far as I can tell, there's no evidence of Christ appearing to someone in a country that has never heard of Jesus.
but I'm not referring to the Christophany.
But you would say that's a form of a mystical experience, right?
Yeah. Well,
so
no,
we can't even have consensus there.
I was trying to make the distinction earlier that we have mystical experience occurs on a spectrum, and on the lighter side of the spectrum, you do have this. It is unique to the individual, but as the further you go up, it becomes a universal phenomenon in consciousness.
Okay, but
what do you mean further you go up?
Yeah, the further so once you hit so this is like hitting partial criteria, like hitting 2 or 3 points on the list. What I'm talking about over here is hitting all 6 simultaneously, and so people throughout history. I mean, you mentioned the one. I'm not too sure if you mentioned it because of the perennial philosophy, or are you referring to Neoplatonism? That was Plotinus' term.
I was referring to perennialism.
And so it has roots in Neoplatonism.
So it seems to me. So okay, let's say this. So let's say there's a room, and I come out and I say, "There's a white elephant in the room." Right now, if you want to know if there is actually a white elephant in the room, what would you do?
I'll go out and investigate.
You go out and look, right? And if what you see is exactly what I describe, right, that would be evidence that this thing exists outside of our head, right?
Sure.
Okay, so what if you went into the room and what you saw didn't match what I described? That would be evidence to the contrary, right?
Yeah.
Right.
What
and
if
then what you might
multiple
do is you
people were
get
going
another
into a
person
room and everybody was seeing different things? Would it not be evidence that that thing isn't there? Like if I say there's a white elephant, Facade said there's a jet ski. You go in there and you say there's a baby, right? Wouldn't that be evidence against the fact that there's a white elephant in the room?
No, definitely. But you see, that's not necessarily what I'm talking about.
Well, okay, but sure, you may not be talking about that. Okay, but what you were saying is that these mystical experiences, they're pulling from some transcendent reality. And what I'm saying is, when people have these mystical experiences, they're pulling not only different things, but they're pulling contradictory things.
Strawman right there. I don't think people are pulling different things, like necessarily, like they may have different interpretations.
No, one guy has Hinduism, another guy pulls Christianity. And as we explained, Christianity makes claims that contradict Hinduism, right? Even the creation account.
One guy has a guy with a magic hammer that creates thunder.
Right.
And by the way, that would directly contradict like Greek religion and Christianity and Roman and like you know what I'm saying? Like these, it'd be like you say you can draw parallels, but we're talking about like, okay, yeah, the parallels is kind of like him seeing an elephant, me seeing a jet ski, and you seeing a baby. The best you can do is that they're all made of atoms, but other than that, these parallels are so far
fetched the same thing.
All right, let me ask
you wouldn't say they're the same thing.
Let me ask you something.
Obviously, give me 1 second. Sorry, I hate to interrupt.
These are very, rich, deep historical, context that we're talking about here. They can't always be simplified to black and white. For instance, you mentioned Greek religion, and you mentioned Thor or Zeus.
He's Norse,
right?
Yeah. Well, Thor would be Norse, and then Zeus would be the Greek.
Did you know that from Plato all the way to Plotinus, from Xenophanes and all the major Greek philosophers did not believe in the mainstream religion of Zeus?
I'm well aware. Like they literally made them up intentionally. By the way, they made them up for the same reason that most religions are made up. They don't do it to create a story of a god or deity. They do it to pass down tales and legends of ways for humans to survive. That is a historical narrative throughout time.
Can I tell you what would be great evidence that they're pulling from some alternate reality?
Sure.
If you had different civilizations coming to the same religious conclusions, like you had the Aztecs, who had no interaction, as far as we know, with with the Middle East, and they were Christians.
Yeah.
Right. So like that would be great evidence. If the Far East, right, the
people in Japan, they weren't.
The people in Japan.
They weren't Shinto.
If everybody was pulling from the same, coming to the same conclusion, because here's something. So like Charles Darwin, right? He's credited with discovering evolution, right? There was another guy. There was another scientist. Didn't talk to Darwin, but came to the same conclusion at the same time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There was another scientist besides Einstein that came up with a model for general relativity that had space time as a fabric. So this is indicative of things that actually are real, right? You're having independent verification, people who are studying stuff and coming to the same conclusion, right? Well, here they're wild. They're not just different conclusions, but they're wildly different.
Yeah, here's the issue. I you may not agree with this, but this is the way I've come to see it. You have various sects of Christianity. You have Protestantism. You have Eastern Orthodox. You have all these various sects of Christianity. But if you go all the way down and follow them to their root, you'll find that they all have root in the Roman Catholic Church. And maybe you've heard of the Hezekiah controversy. Mm-hmm. I believe there's in time throughout history when mysticism would dwindle in the religion, it would be left to the intellect to try to make sense of it. And so then you had different interpretations, and it got kind of haywire, and it's not because they weren't coming to the same conclusion.
I mean, not trying to be rude, but it seems that this mysticism, when intellect gets involved, it's typically because science is showing that religion is wrong. And what I say by that, I mean, like, for instance, we know tsunamis aren't caused by Neptune. We know they're caused by plate tectonics. So we don't need the god of the seas to be angry with someone. We need to know how plate tectonics work. So when intellect gets involved and mysticism starts going away, it's because we keep showing that typically there's not an angry guy with a trident causing these problems in the seas. It's caused by things like underwater earthquakes and plate tectonics.
I don't think mysticism is necessarily going away. I mean, we have it practiced.
Well, you just said instances where mysticism goes away in religion, it's filled by intellect. And it's filled by intellect, right?
Today we have the neuroscience that studies mystical experience, which is found, which resides in this, phenomenon of mysticism. That's where it comes from. It's not like it's a phenomenon that's going away. I think we're starting to learn more about it nowadays.
Can I? So you had said earlier. So you were talking about how like when mysticism steps in, and then people's intellect come in. So you saying so when people's intellect come in, that's when the views start to deviate.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. So that seems it just seems like a very convenient excuse.
I think that's the case, man. I think
but I would argue they're not just deviations, like they're fundamental differences. Like so Christians believe Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. The Jews believe that Jesus was a heretic.
Sure,
right? A blasphemer.
That's the difference. So not only is it the difference of like ideals, but it's the fundamental difference between heaven and hell for people. Like it's not you going outside and seeing a baby in a pink shirt and me going outside and seeing a baby in a blue shirt. It's you going outside and seeing a baby in a pink shirt and me going outside and seeing a pine tree.
Yeah, but like I said, these are very.
That's not an interpretation, man. Like you can't say that's an interpretation. You're killing me here. There's no way that you're going to interpret these things so fundamentally differently.
Well, there's a fundamentalist interpretation of Christianity, and I think most people that hold to Christianity hold that interpretation. I mean,
most people that hold Christianity believe that Jesus was the Son of God, and if you don't believe in him, you're going to hell. That is how you define Christianity in modernity.
This isn't just
Jesus himself didn't believe that.
Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me."
Yeah, that was supposed to
remember
be
John
from Jesus.
3:4, he called all of us gods.
Yeah, but but he wasn't saying they were. No. But he
himself.
wasn't saying they were a path to salvation. This is very different, right? And even in the gods, it's a little g, right? So like Jesus is saying like he's not just God. He is the path to salvation. He's not saying that for other people, right? And then you have the Jews who are saying that Jesus is a blasphemer, who God hates himself. All right. So now the Christianity believes that the Father loves Jesus, right? Jews believe that the Father hates Jesus because he's a blasphemer. Okay. Sorry. So this isn't a small detail. This is the literal distinction between Judaism and Christianity.
No, I think what you're trying to argue is that either Jesus was the God or a God.
No.
He is the only way
I'm not
to
arguing
God.
that at all. It doesn't matter what Jesus is.
According to
the
Jesus.
point is that they don't agree. So if they're pulling from some fundamental part of reality, why are they getting wildly different things? And these aren't small deviations, and these aren't people's intellect taking over. This when the religion came in its inception, that's what it was. So Jesus being the path to salvation, this wasn't something that came about a few years after and people's intellect started taking over. This was the fundamental part. In its inception, that's what it was.
That's what I'm trying to say. That you pedestalize Christ, or you don't, or he's not exclusive. That's the distinction you're making there. And I don't even think
if there's this external knowledge that one can gather from, or there's external thing that's influencing people that start or found world religions, for example, then you would think you'd see much more in common than you do with huge deviations. And upon the inception of Christianity, with the church, and you would say like the Roman Catholic Church, I assume you're talking about like maybe Peter and like the Roman Catholic Church. Literally, the inception of Christianity came about and was a direct conflict with Judaism, which had existed for more than 1,000 years. So if they're drawing from the same source, the same universal beyond themselves, then Peter, when he received his mystical experience, either got it wrong and told the people about it, or didn't get it from the same source that Abraham and the Jewish people got their source from. Because they say that God is a loving God, but very vengeful. And the Christians say God loves Jesus, and he is the only path to salvation. So you have really different stories upon the inception of these world religions that have really, really varied things. And it's not an interpretation issue, because we're not talking about what color someone's shirt is, or maybe you called him Jesus instead of Yeshua, or Christ instead of whatever. We're talking about a fundamental difference in Judaism. The people, like Jewish people, think that Jesus was a heretic, a liar, and hated by God himself. Christians think he is quite literally the way, the truth, the life, the Son of the only God that manifested himself in the flesh to die for your sins. Those are really, really different things. So my question is, if they're drawing from some external, beyond naturalist source, how do we get such a huge distinction?
I'd like to give him like the last word on this too.
Yeah, I got a dip soon. Yeah, sorry. You can have last word. You can respond to that, and if you want to plug anything, you can do that. And if you'd like to come back on and continue this conversation, we can do so. But I think both of us have to go. I just got a phone call, actually.
All right. You don't mind if I have the last word on that?
No, by all means.
No,
take a couple minutes. Right, you can respond to that. You can say the last word. You can plug anything you want, and then we're gonna jump off. But I apologize.
What I'm trying to say is that when you yes, you may find these deviations and these seeming contradictions, But when you scratch all these major religions to their core, you're going to find mysticism. You're going to even the Jews have there is Jewish mysticism. They call it the mystical experience sekha mufla, and what it essentially is, even when some of these mystics throughout all the major religions found themselves encounter with this divine experience, if you want to call it that, they often didn't see themselves as exclusive, and I really believe Christ didn't either. And they would often recognize the current of philosophy. They would recognize, the view that all these religions derive from the same metaphysical source in mysticism. And I did one aspect I didn't mention that I want to mention is that all it is, it's a sense of unity with all a brotherhood among all humanity. There's a sense of infinite unconditional love in there. Once you glimpse that, I mean, I can never hate you, brothers, because but it's coming from that core. And every mystic throughout the ages have always spoken and behaved from that vantage point, from unity, love. And that's why I see the neuroscience and them connecting this phenomenon to all the world's major religions, because they mention the pyramidal philosophy. Look into the neuroscience; they will mention the pyramidal philosophy as correlated with mystical experience. And I see it as a beautiful view, man. I think it's something that could ultimately harmonize religion. It could be something that brings humanity together. Maybe bring peace to the world. I'll leave it at that.
Well, we appreciate you coming on, man.
Yeah, it was a cool
way better than biblically, by the way. You're more than welcome to come back if you'd like some time. Actual good conversation and back and forth, and you didn't just repeat the same thing, so I could have just put it up on the screen. So really appreciate you coming on. Sorry I had to tie it up, but if you'd like to come back on, well, we can chat and we can get you in the email. Thanks, guys, for watching.
I really love the points y'all brought up, man. It was badass. Thank you, man.
Really appreciate it, man. I hope you have a good day. Thanks, guys, for watching. We'll see you guys next time.